So the first argument concerning God's existence, or category of arguments we're going to be looking at, is called the ontological arguments. And ontological arguments are unique in that they attempt to prove God's existence purely from the concept or definition of God. In other words, rather than appealing to empirical evidence to prove God exists, like miracles or religious texts or mystical religious experiences, ontological arguments attempt to prove God's existence using only reason and logic. They attempt to prove God's existence a priori, if you remember that term from the rationalism versus empiricism video. So, in the same way that you don't need to go out into the world and survey all the bachelors to check they're unmarried to know that all bachelors are unmarried, ontological arguments say that you can prove God exists in a similar way, that you can prove God exists purely using logic and the definition of God itself. I'm going to split this video into two kinds of ontological arguments. More traditional ontological arguments and what I'm going to call modern ontological arguments. And this is because of a classic objection from Kant that I'll get to later in the video. So in this video, we're going to look at a bunch of ontological arguments and objections to see whether it really is possible to prove God's existence purely from the definition of God. So the original ontological argument comes from St. Anselm of Canterbury in 1078. And I'll put it on screen exactly, but the gist of Anselm's ontological argument is: 1. God is a being greater than which cannot be conceived. In other words, God is the greatest imaginable or conceivable being. And 2, it's greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. And so from this, it follows that God exists. And the reasoning behind this argument is that if we say God is the greatest conceivable being, but we say that God doesn't exist, then that would contradict the definition of the greatest conceivable being, because if we say God doesn't exist, then we could conceive of a greater being, the one that does exist, again, which would contradict the definition of greatest conceivable being. So this idea of the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality, and so God exists. In other words, imagine two beings. One being is maximally great in every possible way, but doesn't exist. And the other is maximally great in every possible way, but does exist. So which of these two beings is greater? Presumably the one which does exist. And so again, if God is the greatest conceivable being, the greatest possible being, then God has to exist in reality. Otherwise, again, that would contradict the definition of the greatest conceivable or greatest possible being. It might help to think of this in terms of omnipotence, perhaps from the last video. So if you remember, omnipotence means the most powerful being possible, or the most powerful possible being. So if you imagine, a dragon, imagine two dragons. One, which is more powerful, a dragon that exists in reality or a dragon that exists only in the mind? Presumably the dragon that exists in reality. And so if we go with this this isn't Anselm's argument, by the way, but if we go with this definition of God as omnipotent, the most powerful possible being, then again, this being has to exist in reality, because if it didn't exist in reality, it wouldn't be the most powerful possible being. The dragon that exists in reality is more powerful than the dragon that doesn't exist in reality. So in short, Anselm argues that a being greater than which cannot be conceived, i.e. the greatest conceivable being, i.e. God, must exist in reality. And Interestingly, or not, depending on how much of a philosophy nerd you are, this would make God exists an analytic truth. Analytic propositions are propositions that are true in virtue of what the words mean, true by definition. So another example of an analytic proposition would be something like all triangles have three sides, because that's just what the word triangle means, three-sided shape. Like the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being would necessarily include existence in the same way that the definition of a triangle would necessarily include three-sidedness. In other words, it'd be a logical contradiction to say God does not exist. God does not exist would be as contradictory as a four-sided triangle, because God not existing would be the idea of the greatest conceivable being that is not the greatest conceivable being, and that's a logical contradiction, and so God must exist. So there was a bit of a kind of back and forth between Anselm and a monk known as Gaunilo, who was around at the same time as Anselm in the 11th century. And Gaunilo wrote a response to Anselm's ontological argument known as On Behalf of the Fool being the non-believer who rejects God's existence. Gaunilo argued that if Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence works, then you could also apply the same logic to other things, such as the idea of the perfect island is the example he uses. So if we say the perfect island is an island greater than which cannot be conceived, and by the same logic it's greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind, then surely we have to say that this perfect island also exists in reality. And not only that, you could use this same logic to define anything into existence. The perfect dog, the perfect pizza, the perfect tennis ball, whatever. And since we don't take these things to exist in reality, even though these arguments follow the same logic, then this shows that there must be a flaw in Anselm's reasoning here. It's what's known as a reductio ad absurdum, where the conclusion is obviously false, and so the argument must have gone wrong somewhere. Just in case it isn't obvious, Gaunilo isn't arguing that God doesn't exist. He was a monk after all. So Gaunilo's point is simply that Anselm's reasoning here isn't a good argument for God's existence, not that God doesn't exist. So I'm going to come back to Gaunilo and his perfect island, as well as Anselm's response later in the video. But for now, I want to move on to another traditional or classic ontological argument, and that is Descartes' ontological argument. So in Meditations on First Philosophy, the fifth meditation to be precise, Descartes defines God as a supremely perfect being, and since existence is a perfection, Descartes says, God must exist. Just to avoid any confusion, this argument is basically exactly the same as Anselm's argument, just with different words. So if you're thinking that sounds like the same argument, it kind of is. So where Anselm defines God as a being greater than which cannot be conceived, Descartes defines God as a supremely perfect being. And where Anselm says it is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind, Descartes says existence is a perfection. But the upshot of both arguments is that God exists, so it's just basically just slightly different wording. One extra detail Descartes does add, and this goes back to this idea of analytic and synthetic truths from a moment ago. Descartes, although the terms analytic and synthetic didn't exist in Descartes' day, but whatever. Descartes compares God's existence to the three-sidedness of a triangle. He says, "When I think about it more attentively, it becomes manifest that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that three-sidedness can be separated from the essence of a triangle. In other words, Descartes explicitly says that God does not exist is a logical contradiction, just like a four-sided triangle or a married bachelor. Although the idea of God not existing may initially seem like a coherent or conceivable idea, when we think about it more attentively, says Descartes, it becomes clear that the idea of God not existing is incoherent and logically contradictory. Anyway, you might be thinking that Gaunilo's perfect island objection could be equally applied to Descartes' ontological argument here, and you'd be right. Just change greatest conceivable island for supremely perfect island, and you get the same conclusion. But Gaunilo's objection doesn't show why these ontological arguments fail. For that, we need Kant. Kant's objection to ontological arguments, I think it's fair to say, it's generally considered to be the most significant issue. And the objection that Kant makes is that existence is not a predicate. So a predicate is like a property of something. In a sentence, you've got a subject and a predicate. So, for example, the frog is yellow. The subject is the frog. The predicate is yellow. Or Mount Everest is 8,849 meters tall. The subject is Mount Everest and the predicate is 8,849 meters tall. So again, a predicate is like a property of something, and that predicate tells you something about the subject. So again, the predicate 8,849 meters tall tells you something about Mount Everest, or yellow tells you something about the frog. If you were to change that predicate so that it's a red frog, then that changes the concept, because red and yellow and 8,000, if the frog was 8,849 meters tall, that would change the concept of the frog. But existence, says Kant, is not an actual predicate. It doesn't tell you anything about the concept involved like these other examples. Kant says, existence is not a concept of something which could be added to the concept of a thing. It is merely the positing of a thing. So imagine a dog in your mind. And now imagine a dog that exists. What's the difference between those two concepts? What's the difference between the two things you imagined? Well, nothing, because they're both just concepts or ideas. The concept of a dog that exists is the same concept as the concept of an idea of a dog, because existence isn't a real predicate. But if I said to you, imagine a dog that has fur like a zebra, then the idea in your mind has changed, because having fur like a zebra is a real predicate. One of Kant's own examples is to do with thalers, some olden days currency. He says, 100 real thalers do not contain the least more coin than 100 possible thalers. The point is that when we're dealing with ideas, concepts, stuff that's in our minds, adding existence doesn't change that concept. It doesn't make the concept spring from an idea in your mind to something that exists in real life. You can't pay for your shopping with the idea of $100 that exist any more than you can pay for your shopping with the idea of $100, because both ideas are ultimately just ideas. So going back to ontological arguments, Kant says that you can't define something into existence by adding existence to the concept of things. In the same way that adding existence to your idea of $100 doesn't make that idea somehow real, adding existence to your idea of the concept of God doesn't give you a real, actual God that exists in reality. Applied to Descartes' argument specifically, Kant would reject the premise that existence is a perfection. Existence isn't a property that improves anything in any way, like power or knowledge, because it's not, again, a real predicate. I feel like I'm repeating myself a bit here. So even if we imagine a perfect being, and we imagine a perfect being as existing, it doesn't prove that such a being actually does exist. It just shows that our concept has the property of existence, not that that concept matches anything in physical reality. And applied to Anselm's ontological argument, Kant would reject the idea that existence makes a being greater. So, if you remember, Anselm says that God, as the greatest possible being, must exist in reality because it's greater to exist in reality than the mind. But Kant says it doesn't work like that. Existence isn't a greatness or a quality you can compare. It doesn't make that concept greater or more impressive. So in short, Kant says you can't define something into existence by adding existence to a concept. You can't make the transition from conceptual to actual by adding existence to a concept, because you'd still be within the realm of the conceptual. Adding existence to the concept of God doesn't change that concept, because you're still dealing with the conceptual realm. So again, the concept of God and the concept of God that exists are still ultimately the same idea, the same concept. So, modern ontological arguments. I'm calling them this because they come after Kant and his existence is not a predicate objection. And the first such modern ontological argument I want to talk about comes from Norman Malcolm in 1960, I think. And, well, I suppose technically it's not a modern ontological argument at all, because Malcolm's whole point is that Anselm's original ontological argument all those years ago wasn't just that God exists and so God has the property of existence or the predicate of existence, which, as we said with Kant, isn't a real predicate. Malcolm says that a proper understanding of Anselm's ontological argument is not that God has the property of existence, but that God has the property of necessary existence, and this is a real predicate. So some vocabulary. I might have talked about this already in the rationalism versus empiricism video, and this is the distinction between contingent and necessary. So a contingent truth is something that is true, but that might not have been true, or that doesn't have to be true. So for example, Paris is the capital of France is a contingent truth because while it is true, it could have been false if whoever decided to make Paris the capital had decided to make Marseille or Lyon the capital instead. In contrast, necessary truths are truths that are true, have always been true, and couldn't possibly be false. 2 + 2 = 4, for example. It just wouldn't make sense that in any universe, 2 + 2 could give you anything other than 4. Even if I was transported to another dimension where time runs backwards and aliens walk on the ceiling, I would still know that 2 + 2 = 4 because 2 + 2 is necessarily equals 4. What are you talking about, man? This is the difference between a contingent truth and a necessary truth. And the vocabulary means the same thing in the context of contingent existence and necessary existence. So you, viewer, exist contingently because if your parents never met, then you wouldn't exist. Whereas God is said to exist necessarily. God's existence isn't contingent on anything. Before we go any further, I just want to quickly point out how this distinction between contingent and necessary existence potentially avoids Gaunilo's perfect island objection, because although you could say, the perfect island is one that exists necessarily, and define it that way, that's kind of a bit of a weird argument, because an island isn't the kind of thing really that could have necessary existence. Like, you could try to define the perfect island as the one that exists necessarily, but that doesn't really make sense for what an island is. An island is a physical, spatial, material thing, and things like that just aren't the kinds of things that can exist necessarily. I was just thinking about an example to try and illustrate this. So I don't think this example works perfectly, but just to illustrate the point, like if someone said 7 is the loudest number by definition, they defined it that way. Yeah, so a number isn't the kind of thing that could make a noise at all. So there's no kind of loudest number. And likewise, like islands and dogs aren't the kinds of things that could have necessary existence, whereas God is. And so with these modern ontological arguments where we're talking about necessary existence, Gaunilo's perfect island objection potentially doesn't apply because, again, islands or dogs or whatever, these other things, they aren't the kind of thing that could have necessary existence in the first place. And so you can try and add that into your definition, but people probably aren't going to buy it. Anyway, this property of necessary existence is a real predicate. It changes the concept and adds something to the idea. And so Malcolm accepts Kant's objection that existence is not a predicate, but he argues that a proper understanding of Anselm's ontological argument, or at least the version in chapter 3 of Proslogion, says not only that God exists, but that God exists necessarily. And again, necessary existence is a real predicate, so it avoids this objection. Malcolm says, previously I rejected existence as a perfection. However, Anselm is maintaining not that existence is a perfection, but that the logical impossibility of non-existence is a perfection. In other words, necessary existence is a perfection. His first ontological proof uses the principle that a thing is greater if it exists than if it does not exist. However, his second proof employs the different principle that a thing is greater if it necessarily exists than if it does not necessarily exist. Okay, so with this idea of necessary existence in mind, Malcolm runs with Anselm's definition of God as a being greater than which cannot be conceived, or the greatest conceivable being, or whatever the exact wording is. So Malcolm accepts this definition of God and uses it to argue that God exists necessarily. So Malcolm's argument can be summarized like this. Either God, as defined a moment ago, exists, or he doesn't exist. If God does exist, God would exist necessarily, because, again, necessary existence is a perfection, so if God didn't exist necessarily, we could conceive of a greater being, which would contradict our definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. So again, if God exists necessarily, and this follows from the definition of God. But if God doesn't exist, then God's existence is impossible, and this again follows from the definition of God. If God doesn't exist now, but springs into existence tomorrow, then that wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, because we could conceive of a greater being, the one that always existed. So we can simplify the argument at this point to a disjunction of two options. 1, either God exists necessarily, or 2, God's existence is impossible. But Malcolm says God's existence is not impossible. God's existence would only be impossible if the concept of God is logically contradictory. So if God's existence is either impossible or necessary, but it's not impossible, then the only remaining option is that God exists necessarily. And so the conclusion is that, therefore, God exists necessarily. So one way you could respond to Malcolm's ontological argument here is at the disjunction bit where Malcolm says either God's existence is impossible or God's existence is necessary. You could go down you could argue that God's existence is impossible, basically. But I don't want to pursue this line of argument too deeply here, because that was basically the topic of the last video. That'd be things like the problem of the stone, paradox of the stone, whatever. I'll link it somewhere. So you could respond to this argument by saying God's existence is logically contradictory and therefore impossible. Instead, a different potential response to Malcolm's ontological argument is to say it commits, I don't know if it's equivocation or the modal scope fallacy. It might actually be both, but if we say Malcolm's argument is essentially that either God's existence is necessary or God's existence is impossible, God's existence is not impossible, therefore God exists necessarily. If that's kind of the gist of Malcolm's ontological argument, then the meaning of necessary kind of switches between the premise where we're talking about necessary existence in the sense of a property that something has if it exists, whereas in the conclusion, God exists necessarily is taken to mean something like it is a necessary truth that God exists. But although that might sound very similar, these two claims are they mean different things. So basically, we might agree with the initial premise that if God exists, then God would exist necessarily, but reject the conclusion that God exists necessarily in the sense that it is a necessary truth that God exists. They don't mean the same thing. So basically, you could argue that all Malcolm's argument really shows is if God exists, God would exist necessarily. But the antecedent, the first part basically, the if God exists, is still up for debate. Malcolm's just shown again, if God exists necessarily, but he hasn't shown that God does actually exist necessarily, if that makes sense. So this brings us to what I think is kind of considered to be the pinnacle of ontological arguments, at least at the moment. And this is Alvin Plantinga's ontological argument. So Plantinga's ontological argument is based on modal logic, which basically just means reasoning about possibility and necessity across possible worlds, like parallel universes. It's not a huge difference, but for the pedants out there, Plantinga doesn't use Anselm's and Malcolm's definition of God as a being greater than which cannot be conceived or whatever it is. Instead, Plantinga talks about God as a maximally great being, which he defines more specifically as a being that's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and that exists necessarily across all possible worlds. And Plantinga's definition of God is maybe a bit more precise, but like I said, this is quite a pedantic point. Anyway, with that definition in mind of a maximally great being that exists across all possible worlds, Plantinga's ontological argument goes like this. It's possible that this maximally great being exists. And if this maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world, because otherwise it wouldn't be maximally great. It would contradict the definition of a maximally great being. And so therefore, a maximally great being exists in every possible world. And so therefore, a maximally great being exists in our actual world. And therefore, God exists. Like I said, I think this ontological argument is generally considered to be the strongest ontological argument going. There's no modal scope fallacy, no equivocation. It avoids the existence is not a predicate objection. Plantinga isn't saying that if God exists necessarily, which is where Malcolm's argument went wrong. Plantinga just starts with the possibility of the existence of this maximally great being, and then kind of modal logic does the rest. So basically the only ways to respond to this argument are, one, to reject the possibility of this maximally great being, or two, I suppose you could reject modal logic altogether, but anyway. It's a good argument, I think. It's clever. So the final objection to ontological arguments I want to talk about today comes from David Hume. And Hume would reject the first premise of Plantinga's ontological argument, that it's even possible for this maximally great being to exist. Hume says, "Nothing that is distinctly conceivable implies a contradiction. Whatever we conceive as existent, we can also conceive as not existent. There is no being, therefore, whose non-existence implies a contradiction. It is pretended that God is a necessarily existent being, and this necessity of his existence is attempted to be explained by asserting that, if we knew his whole essence or nature, we should perceive it to be as impossible for him not to exist as for twice two not to be four. But it is evident that this can never happen while our faculties remain the same as at present. It will still be possible for us at any time to conceive the non-existence of what we formerly conceived to exist. The words, therefore, necessary existence, have no meaning, or, which is the same thing, none that is consistent." So like I said earlier in Anselm's ontological argument, if any of these ontological arguments succeed, whether it's Anselm's, Malcolm's, Plantinga's, or Descartes' version, if these ontological arguments succeed, then God exists would be an analytic truth. It would be true by definition. Now, of course, the term analytic truth didn't exist in Hume's day. It was coined by Kant a bit later on. But the point is that if these ontological arguments succeed, God does not exist would be a logical contradiction, like a married bachelor or a four-sided triangle. However, and this is Hume's whole point, contradictions are inconceivable. We can't imagine them because they are not coherent ideas. So if you try to imagine a four-sided triangle, for example, what do you imagine? Either you imagine a four-sided shape, in which case you're imagining a square, or you're imagining a triangle, in which case you're imagining a three-sided shape. But the idea of a four-sided triangle is not a conceivable idea because the terms contradict each other. However, the example of God not existing doesn't work the same way. Where we can't even imagine a four-sided triangle, it seems that we can conceive of God not existing. As Hume says, anything we can conceive of as existing, we can also conceive of as not existing. So to summarise Hume's argument here, Hume says that if ontological arguments succeed, God does not exist would be a logical contradiction. And for Hume, the key feature of a logical contradiction is that it's inconceivable, like a four-sided triangle. But God does not exist is not inconceivable. Again, we can just as easily imagine God not existing as we can imagine God existing. And so, in short, Hume says that a necessarily existing being, one whose non-existence is impossible and logically contradictory, is impossible. If you wanted a response to this objection, I'd refer back to the part in the video where I was talking about Descartes. What was it you said again? When I think about it more attentively, it becomes manifest that existence can no more be separated from the essence of God than the fact that the sum of its three angles is equal to two right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle. So Descartes would say, although Hume might think in his feeble mind that the concept of God the idea of God not existing is a coherent and conceivable idea, when you think about it more attentively, you realise that the idea of God not existing is a logical contradiction. So perhaps in the same way that an inexperienced geometry person may think that you could have a triangle whose angles add up to something other than 180 degrees, the person who understands geometry properly understands that that's actually an inconceivable notion. And so by analogy, the person who properly understands God's essence understands that God has to exist, that existence can't be separated from the concept of God any more than angles adding up to 180 degrees can be removed from the concept of a triangle. So in summary, ontological arguments are a class of arguments which attempt to prove God's existence a priori solely from the concept or definition of God, without relying on any a posteriori evidence or experience or observation. And so we looked at a bunch of different ontological arguments. So Anselm and Malcolm run with this definition of God as a being greater than which cannot be conceived. Descartes defined God as a supremely perfect being, and Plantinga defined God as a maximally great being. But these slight differences in definitions, I would say, were less important than the general structure of the arguments. The most important structural difference being, does the argument aim to show that God exists, or that God exists necessarily? This distinction was important in light of Kant's objection to ontological arguments that existence is not a predicate. Adding existence to an idea or a concept doesn't change that idea or concept in any meaningful way. It's still just a concept or idea. And so what I called the traditional ontological arguments, like Anselm's first version or Descartes' ontological argument, these arguments fell foul of this mistake. They assume that existence is a predicate, and so make the unsupported leap from concept to actual real-world existence. However, what I called the modern ontological arguments, you might also call these modal ontological arguments, such as those proposed by Alvin Plantinga and Norman Malcolm, attempt to avoid this existence is not a predicate objection. Rather than saying existence is a predicate, they talk about possibility and necessity, necessary existence across possible worlds, and whether the concept of God as a necessarily existing being is logically coherent or possible. Because if such a being is even possible, then, so the argument goes, such a being must exist in all possible worlds, including the actual world, and so God exists. We also considered Gaunilo's perfect island objection, which takes the same structure as ontological arguments, but substitutes perfect island in the place of perfect being. And if we can deduce an obviously false conclusion that this perfect island must exist, using the same logic as these ontological arguments, then these ontological arguments must go wrong somewhere in their chain of reasoning. Finally, we considered Hume's objection to a priori arguments for existence, that any being we can imagine existing, we can also imagine as not existing. I touched on how Descartes would potentially deny this. Descartes would say that, in the case of God, a proper understanding of the concept reveals God's non-existence to be inconceivable. But if Hume's epistemology is correct here regarding conceivability and possibility, then God's non-existence is conceivable, and so it is possible, and so it's impossible for a being to exist necessarily. So after I finished filming this video, I found a nice quote from Bertrand Russell that kind of summarises a lot of people's reactions to ontological arguments. So Russell says, "It's easier to feel convinced that ontological arguments must be fallacious than it is to find out precisely where the fallacy lies." So that's about it for ontological arguments. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to try and get through the books quite quickly today because all these ontological arguments have... I'll link the page on my website that talks about ontological arguments. I'll link that as always, the Stanford page. I doubt anyone ever clicks through from my YouTube videos to Stanford, but I'll link that as well. And then, as always, you can get my book. The book contains some of the arguments I went over today, but I don't actually talk about Plantinga's ontological argument in this book. So if you want to know more about that, then I'm going to have to go elsewhere. And then, as for primary sources, Anselm's Proslogion, it gets a thumbs up from me. Very short book, and it contains this short text contains both Anselm's ontological arguments and the replies of Gaunilo with the perfect island, and Anselm's replies to Gaunilo. So if you're into your ontological arguments, get yourself a copy. Then, I mean, what's more to say about Meditations by Descartes? I've raved about it enough in the epistemology video, so if you haven't got yourself a copy by now, what's wrong with you? Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the classic. I read this every night before I go to bed. A real page turner. Don't be disguised by the fact that it is 9,000 pages long. It is the most accessible, concise. It's basically like reading a novel. So the Critique of Pure Reason, which is where the existence is not a predicate objection comes from. You can get that. Then, right, I'll also link, so Malcolm's ontological argument is from a philosophy journal paper. I don't think it's in the public domain, but I'll link that. Plantinga's ontological argument, it comes from, he's written it in a book called, I think, God, Freedom and Evil, which I don't have. But I did manage to find a PDF called The Nature of Necessity by Plantinga, which also lists his modal ontological argument. And then I also mentioned David Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. This is where the argument against the possibility of a necessary being, this generic argument against a priori arguments for existence comes from. And I think I'm going to be referencing this Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion maybe quite a lot over the course of the next few videos, because Hume talks a lot about teleological arguments in this book as well. But I think that's about it for this video, isn't it? So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I will see you in the next one.